Sometimes the most invisible people carry extraordinary secrets. In a weathered coastal town, Mae Wallace has lived quietly for 60 years. Her story buried like treasure. When she was just 10 years old, friendless and grieving her mother's death, Mae had only her loyal dog Biscuit and 2 crumpled dollar bills from odd jobs. With that money, she bought a rotting fishing trawler abandoned on the shoreline, more for hope than purpose. What she discovered beneath the decaying floorboards changed everything. A cache of stolen war-era bonds worth $75 million. But Mae didn't cash in. Instead, she made a choice that quietly saved lives and transformed her community forever. What could make a 10-year-old girl walk away from unimaginable wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through salt-stained windows of Mae Wallace's modest home, casting gentle shadows across walls lined with photographs of children she'd helped through the years, though none who knew the source of their good fortune. At 68, Mae moved with the careful grace of someone who'd spent decades carrying secrets. Her silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for 40 years as a school custodian. The documentary crew had arrived precisely at 9, as scheduled. Mae watched from her kitchen window as they unloaded equipment from their van, noting the careful way they handled their cameras, the respectful distance they maintained from her garden gate. She'd agreed to this interview after months of gentle persistence from the producer, a thoughtful woman named Sarah, who'd heard whispers of Mae's story through her research into local legends. Mrs. Wallace? Sarah's voice carried the soft authority of someone accustomed to coaxing stories from reluctant subjects. "We're ready when you are." Mae's fingers found the small silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. The locket was tarnished now, its surface worn smooth by decades of worried touches, but inside remained the tiny photograph of her mother, the last tangible connection to a woman who died too young, leaving her daughter to navigate the world alone. The coastal town of Millbrook stretched beyond Mae's windows like a faded watercolor painting. Once vibrant buildings now bore the weathered patina of economic struggle, their paint peeling in the salt air that swept inland from the harbor. Fishing boats bobbed at anchor, fewer each year as the industry that had sustained 3 generations slowly died. The main street told the same story. Empty storefronts outnumbered thriving businesses, and the young people left for opportunities in larger cities, leaving behind aging parents and childhood memories. But Mae knew something others didn't. She knew that beneath the surface struggles, this community possessed a resilience that had been quietly nurtured for 6 decades. The medical clinic that had saved countless lives, the community center where children learned and seniors gathered, the anonymous scholarships that had sent dozens of young people to college. All of it connected to a secret she'd guarded since she was 10 years old. "I suppose you'll want to know about the boat," Mae said, settling into her favorite chair as the cameras began rolling. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who'd spent years thinking carefully before speaking. "Everyone in town has heard pieces of the story, but they don't know the whole truth. They don't know about the choice that changed everything." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but alert. "Tell us about that summer, Mae. Tell us about 1963. Mae's hands smoothed her skirt, buying herself a moment to step back through the decades. "I was 10 years old that summer. Just 10, but I'd already learned that the world could take everything from you in an instant. My mother had been gone 6 months, cancer, and I was living with my Aunt Ruby, my mother's sister, who'd taken me in more from duty than love." The words came slowly at first, like water through a rusted pipe. But Mae had lived with this story for so long that once it began flowing, it carried its own momentum. Millbrook was different then. The fishing industry was struggling, but it was still alive. Men would head out before dawn and return with the day's catch, their boats heavy with the promise of another day's survival. But even then you could see the cracks. The boats were older, the catches smaller. Families were beginning to worry about what came next. Mae paused, her fingers working the locket again. For a young black girl in a town that was 90% white, life was a careful navigation. Most folks were decent enough, but decent doesn't mean welcoming. I had no friends at school, no invitations to birthday parties. My only companion was Biscuit, a golden retriever mix with mismatched ears and the biggest heart you ever saw. The cameras captured the softness that entered Mae's voice when she spoke of her dog, the way her eyes brightened with a memory that still brought joy after all these years. Biscuit had belonged to Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner market. When she passed that spring, her nephew was going to take Biscuit to the shelter. I begged Aunt Ruby to let me keep him. It was the only time I ever saw her consider something just because it might make me happy. Maybe she saw how much I needed that dog, or maybe she just didn't want to deal with a grieving child alone. Either way, Biscuit became mine. Mae's house reflected her practical nature. Furniture that had served faithfully for decades, walls painted in soothing blues and whites that echoed the coastal setting. But everywhere were small touches that spoke of a deeper generosity. Hand-knitted Afghans she'd made for church sales. Books about education and child development from her years working at the school. Photographs of graduation ceremonies where she'd watched her children receive diplomas funded by scholarship money they'd never know came from her. That summer of '63, I was determined to earn my own money. Aunt Ruby provided the necessities, but there was no allowance, no spending money for a 10-year-old's dreams. So I found work wherever I could, weeding Mrs. Patterson's garden for a quarter, helping Mr. Johnson carry groceries for the elderly folks who couldn't manage on their own, cleaning the church windows for 50 cents. Mae's voice took on the cadence of someone reliving a transformative time. Every penny went into a mason jar I kept hidden under my bed. Biscuit would lie there watching me count it by candlelight. Those dollar bills and quarters that represented something bigger than money. They represented possibility. The documentary crew remained silent, sensing they were witnessing something rare. A woman finally ready to share a secret that had shaped not just her life, but the lives of countless others. By late July, I had saved $2.17. To you, that might sound like nothing. But to a 10-year-old girl in 1963, it was freedom. It was the power to make a choice, to buy something that was mine alone. Mae's eyes grew distant, seeing not the interviewer's face, but a beach from 60 years ago, and a boat that would change everything. That's when I saw her for the first time, the old fishing trawler beached on the north side of the harbor. She was maybe 30 feet long, her paint faded to the color of old bones, her cabin windows clouded with salt and neglect. Everyone said she was worthless, just another reminder of better times. But when I looked at her, I saw something different. I saw a possibility. The afternoon light was shifting now, casting longer shadows across Mae's living room. Outside, the sounds of modern Millbrook continued. Cars passing, children calling to each other, the distant cry of seagulls. But Mae's voice carried them all back to that pivotal summer, when a lonely child's decision would echo through generations. I'd walk past that boat every day on my way to the harbor, where I'd help the fishermen sort their catch for spare change. Biscuit would follow, his tail wagging as we explored the shoreline. But he always paused when we reached that old trawler, as if he sensed something I couldn't yet understand. Mae shifted in her chair, and for a moment she was no longer a 68-year-old woman, but a determined child with a dog by her side and possibility burning bright in her heart. I didn't know that boat would become the key to everything, the discovery that would test everything I believed about right and wrong, about helping others and the true meaning of wealth. All I knew was that for the first time since my mother died, I felt something that wasn't grief or loneliness. I felt hope. The day that changed everything started like any other. Mae woke before dawn to the sound of fishing boats heading out to sea, their engines coughing to life in the harbor darkness. Biscuit stretched beside her bed, his tail already wagging with anticipation for their morning walk. And Ruby was still asleep, her snores echoing through the thin walls of their rented cottage. Mae dressed quietly, pulled on her worn sneakers, and slipped out into the salt-tinged morning air. The mason jar under her bed now held exactly $2, a sum that felt monumental to her 10-year-old hands. Today, she'd decided she would finally approach the owner of the beach trawler. The boat sat where it had for months, listing slightly to one side in the sand beyond the reach of high tide. In the early morning light, she looked even more forlorn than usual. Her blue paint had faded to grey. Her cabin windows were spider-webbed with cracks, and her hull bore the scars of years spent fighting the sea. Most adults walked past without a second glance, but Mae saw something they missed. She's not much to look at, is she? Mae turned to find old Pete Morrison standing behind her, his weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Pete owned a half-dozen fishing boats and had been part of Millbrook's maritime community for 40 years. Everyone knew he'd tried everything to get rid of the abandoned trawler. "I think she's beautiful," Mae said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Pete laughed, but not unkindly. "Beautiful? Child, that boat hasn't seen water in 2 years. Her engine's seized, her hull's got more holes than a fishing net, and her cabin roof leaks like a sieve. She's fit for nothing but scrapwood." Mae walked closer to the boat, running her small hand along the weathered hull. "What's her name?" "The Wandering Rose," Pete said, following her around the vessel. "Built in 1943, served 3 different families before she ended up here. Last owner couldn't afford the repairs after she ran aground in the storm of '61. How much would someone have to pay to own her?" Mae asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Pete stopped walking and studied the serious-faced child before him. "You're Ruby's niece, aren't you? The one who lost her mother?" Mae nodded, her hand finding the locket at her throat. Why would a 10-year-old girl want to buy a broken-down fishing boat? Mae considered the question carefully. The truth was complicated. The boat represented freedom, possibility, something that belonged to her alone, in a world where everything else had been lost or taken away. But she was smart enough to know that adults didn't always understand a child's dreams. "I want to fix her up," Mae said finally. "Maybe not to fish, but to have a place that's mine." Pete's expression softened. He'd raised 3 daughters of his own and recognized the longing in Mae's voice. "Well, I suppose that depends on what you can afford. I've been trying to get rid of her for months. County says I have to move her or pay fines." Mae's heart raced. "I have $2. Pete blinked, then laughed again, but this time the sound was warmer. $2? Child, I paid $50 in towing fees just to get her off the rocks." "It's all I have," Mae said quietly. "I earned it doing odd jobs all summer." Something in her tone made Pete pause. He looked at the determination in her young face, at Biscuit sitting patiently beside her, and then at the boat that had become nothing but a problem for him. $2 won't buy much of anything," he said slowly. "It'll buy this boat if you let it." Mae replied. Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying the girl and the vessel that had brought them together. Finally, he shook his head with what looked like amazement. "You know what? You're right. $2 it is." He extended his weathered hand to her. "But I want you to understand what you're buying. That boat is broken in ways you can't even see yet. She'll need more work than a child can give her." Mae shook his hand solemnly. "I understand." 20 minutes later, Mae stood holding a water-stained piece of paper that officially transferred ownership of the Wandering Rose from Pete Morrison to Mae Wallace. The document was barely legible, its corners soft with age and salt air, but it was hers. For the first time since her mother's death, Mae owned something that no one could take away. The news of Mae's purchase spread through Millbrook with the speed of all small-town gossip. By afternoon, curious neighbors had wandered down to the beach to see what the odd little girl planned to do with her acquisition. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store shook her head in bewilderment. "That child's got more ambition than sense. What's she gonna do with that wreck?" Mr. Johnson, who employed Mae for odd jobs, was more philosophical. "Girl's got grit, I'll give her that. Takes something special to see potential where others see problems." But it was Aunt Ruby's reaction that stung the most. When Mae returned home that evening, glowing with pride and clutching her deed, her aunt's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "You spent your money on what?" Ruby's voice cracked with exasperation. "A boat," Mae said, holding up the deed like a shield. "That's not a boat, child. That's a pile of rotting wood that's going to bring nothing but trouble. Do you have any idea how much it costs to fix something like that?" Mae's excitement dimmed, but didn't disappear. "I can learn to fix her myself. You're 10 years old. You can't fix a boat. You can't even reach half the things that need fixing." Ruby sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. "Of all the foolish things. I should have been watching your money better." "It was my money," Mae said quietly. "I earned it, and now it's gone. Thrown away on some fantasy about fixing a boat." Ruby looked at her niece with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been concern. "What happens when winter comes and that thing is still sitting there falling apart? What happens when the county decides it's an eyesore and makes you pay to have it removed?" Mae had no answers to these questions, but she also had no regrets. The deed in her hand represented more than ownership. It represented the first choice she'd made since her mother died, the first step toward building something of her own. Over the following days, Mae spent every free moment at the boat. She explored every inch of the wandering rows, cataloguing the damage with the methodical attention of someone much older. The cabin windows were indeed cracked. The engine was certainly seized, and the wooden deck had soft spots that gave under her weight. But she also found treasures, a compass that still pointed north, a ship's wheel worn smooth by countless hands, a small galley with cabinets that still closed properly. In the captain's cabin, she discovered a narrow bunk where she could sit with Biscuit and watch the harbor through salt-stained windows. It was during one of these quiet explorations that Mae first noticed something odd about the cabin floor. Most of the planking was solid, weathered but sound. But near the foot of the bunk, one section seemed different. The boards were slightly warped, and when she walked across them, they made a hollow sound that echoed strangely in the small space. Biscuit noticed it too. The dog would sit beside that particular spot and whine softly, pawing at the boards with an intensity that puzzled Mae. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the irregularity nagged at her. One evening, as the sun set over Millbrook Harbor and cast long shadows through the cabin, Mae knelt beside the suspicious floorboards and pressed her ear to the wood. The hollow sound was definitely there, different from the solid thunk of the other planks. "What do you think, Biscuit?" she whispered to her dog. "Think there's something under here?" Biscuit's tail wagged once, as if in agreement. Mae had no tools for investigation, and the light was fading fast. But as she prepared to leave her boat for the night, she made a mental note to return with something that might help her explore further. She had no way of knowing that beneath those loose floorboards lay a discovery that would test every moral principle her mother had taught her, challenge every assumption about right and wrong, and ultimately transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in Millbrook. For now, Mae Wallace was simply a 10-year-old girl with a broken boat and a mystery to solve. But even that was more than she'd had when the day began. Over the next 3 weeks, Mae and Biscuit developed a routine as predictable as the tides. Every morning after helping with breakfast dishes, Mae would announce she was checking on her boat and head down to the harbor with Biscuit trotting beside her, his worn leather collar jingling softly with each step. The collar had belonged to him when Mrs. Chen owned him, cracked brown leather with a small brass nameplate that simply read "Biscuit" in careful script. Mae had considered replacing it with something newer, but the collar seemed as much a part of him as his mismatched ears and gentle brown eyes. Besides, replacing things cost money she didn't have, and Biscuit seemed perfectly content with his weathered accessory. Mae's explorations of the wandering rows became increasingly systematic. She started with the cabin, learning the purpose of every fixture and instrument. The ship's wheel, despite its worn appearance, still turned smoothly. The compass, though its brass was tarnished green, pointed steadily north when Mae held it level. In the tiny galley, she discovered that the small stove was actually in working condition, needing only a fuel source to bring it back to life. The pilot house contained mysteries that fascinated her. Charts of the local coastline were still tucked into wooden slots behind the wheel, their edges water-stained but readable. Mae spent hours studying these maps, tracing shipping routes with her finger and imagining the wandering Rose in her prime, cutting through waves with purpose and grace. But it was in the captain's cabin that Mae felt most at home. The small space had an intimacy that reminded her of reading nooks her mother had created in their old house, cozy spaces where stories came alive and imagination flourished. Mae would sit on the narrow bunk, with Biscuit curled beside her, watching harbour life through the cracked windows and dreaming of repairs that might one day be possible. The boat became more than a possession. It became refuge. When Aunt Ruby's sighs grew too heavy, or the loneliness of friendless days pressed too hard, Mae would escape to the wandering Rose. Here, with only Biscuit for company, she could be the captain of her own vessel, the author of her own adventures. Biscuit adapted to their maritime routine with enthusiasm, but Mae noticed he had particular preferences aboard the boat. He loved the pilot house, where he could see in all directions and watch for approaching strangers. He enjoyed the open deck, where he could feel the sea breeze and track the scents it carried from across the water. But in the captain's cabin, Biscuit's behavior was different. He would settle contentedly on the bunk beside Mae, but his attention kept returning to that section of flooring near the foot of the bed. Sometimes he would lower his head and sniff along the gaps between boards, his tail still but alert. Other times, he would place his paw deliberately on the suspicious planks, looking up at Mae as if trying to communicate something important. "What is it, boy?" Mae would ask, but Biscuit would only whine softly and return his attention to the floor. Mae's own curiosity about the loose boards grew stronger each day. The hollow sound they made when tapped was distinctly different from the solid thunk of the surrounding planks. More troubling, the boards seemed to shift slightly under pressure, as if they weren't properly secured to the underlying framework. One afternoon, emboldened by weeks of familiarity with her boat, Mae decided to investigate more thoroughly. She'd brought along a butter knife borrowed from Aunt Ruby's kitchen, ostensibly for scraping barnacles from the hull, but actually intended for more detailed exploration. Kneeling beside the suspicious section of floor, Mae carefully inserted the blade between two planks and applied gentle pressure. To her surprise, the gap widened easily, revealing darkness beneath. Biscuit immediately moved closer, his nose working overtime to analyze the scents emerging from the opening. "Well, I'll be," Mae whispered, unconsciously echoing an expression she'd heard old Pete use, working more confidently now. Mae discovered that 3 floorboards had been deliberately loosened from their supports. With careful manipulation, she was able to lift them entirely, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the cabin floor. The space was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, carved from the area between the cabin floor and the boat's hull. But what took Mae's breath away wasn't the size of the compartment, but its contents. Wrapped packages filled the hidden space, each one carefully bound in oiled cloth and tied with cord that had somehow resisted years of dampness. The packages were different sizes, some flat like books, others thick and rectangular. All were wrapped with the same meticulous care, as if someone had taken great pains to protect their contents from time and weather. Mae's hands trembled as she lifted the first package from its hiding place. It was heavier than expected, and the oiled cloth crinkled softly as she turned it over in her hands. Biscuit watched intently, his head cocked at an angle that suggested he found this development both fascinating and concerning. Setting the package on the cabin bunk, Mae carefully untied the cord that bound it. The oiled cloth fell away to reveal a leather portfolio, its surface darkened with age but still supple. Inside the portfolio were documents, dozens of them, each one more puzzling than the last. The papers were official-looking, with elaborate seals and formal lettering. Some bore foreign text that Mae couldn't read, while others displayed numbers and signatures in careful script. But what struck her most was the quality of the documents themselves. Heavy paper, embossed seals, the kind of formal presentation that suggested importance and value. Mae had seen similar documents once before, when her mother's lawyer had handled the settling of their small estate. These papers had the same official weight, the same aura of significance that had made 10-year-old Mae feel very small and very lost, but these documents were different. The seals bore unfamiliar symbols. The signatures were in languages she didn't recognize, and the numbers, when she could decipher them, seemed impossibly large. Bearer bond was printed at the top of several documents, words that meant nothing to Mae but were repeated often enough to suggest importance. Some papers displayed what looked like monetary amounts, though the currencies were foreign and the sums seemed fantastical. Biscuit whined softly as Mae spread more documents across the bunk. His concern seemed to mirror her own growing unease. These weren't the kind of papers someone hid carelessly. They weren't forgotten possessions or mementos stored for safekeeping. These documents had been concealed deliberately, protected against discovery, with careful wrapping and hidden placement. Mae's heart began to race as the implications settled over her. Someone had used her boat, the Wandering Rose, as a hiding place for something valuable enough to warrant elaborate concealment. Someone had trusted this vessel with secrets important enough to risk everything in their protection. But who? And why? And what did it mean that 10-year-old Mae Wallace had stumbled upon their hiding place? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating a weight in Mae's chest that felt almost physical. She was no longer just the owner of a broken-down fishing boat. She was the keeper of someone else's secrets, the guardian of mysteries she didn't understand. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the scattered documents, Mae made her first adult decision about the discovery. She would tell no one, not Aunt Ruby, not old Pete, not anyone, until she understood what she'd found. Carefully, reverently, she began returning the documents to their leather portfolio. Whatever these papers represented, whoever had hidden them, they deserved more consideration than a 10-year-old's impulsive revelation could provide. But as Mae rewrapped the portfolio in its oiled cloth and returned it to the hidden compartment, she knew her life had changed irrevocably. The Wandering Rose was no longer just her refuge from loneliness. It was the keeper of secrets that might be more valuable than anything she'd ever imagined. Biscuit's collar jingled softly as he settled beside her, and Mae found comfort in the familiar sound. Whatever lay ahead, whatever these discoveries might mean, she wouldn't face it alone. Her loyal companion would be beside her, as steady and faithful as he'd been since the day she'd saved him from the shelter. Together, they would guard these secrets until understanding came. Mae spent 2 sleepless nights thinking about the documents hidden beneath her boat's floor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those formal papers with their foreign seals and mysterious numbers. The phrase, "bearer bond," repeated in her mind like a puzzle piece that refused to fit anywhere in her 10-year-old understanding of the world. On the 3rd day, she made a decision that would change everything. The Millbrook Public Library was a small brick building that smelled of old books and floor wax. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, was a kind woman in her 50s who'd always treated Mae with gentle respect, never asking uncomfortable questions about her motherless state or her aunt's distant manner. "Well, hello there, Mae," Mrs. Henderson said as Mae approached the reference desk. Biscuit waiting patiently outside in the shade. "What can I help you find today?" Mae had rehearsed this moment, but her mouth still felt dry as she spoke. "I'm doing a school project about different kinds of money. I was wondering if you could help me understand what bearer bonds are." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bearer bonds? That's quite an advanced topic for a young lady your age. What grade did you say you were going into?" "5th, Mae replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "My teacher said we should challenge ourselves with difficult subjects." "Well, that's certainly true." Mrs. Henderson led Mae to a section of financial reference books. Bearer bonds are quite fascinating, actually. They're different from regular bonds because they belong to whoever physically holds them, the bearer. No names are recorded, no registration required. Mae's heart began to pound as Mrs. Henderson pulled down a thick volume and opened it to a chapter on securities and investments. "See here," the librarian continued, pointing to a diagram. A bearer bond is essentially a loan certificate. Someone loans money to a government or corporation, and in return they receive this bond, promising repayment with interest. But unlike registered bonds, bearer bonds can be transferred simply by handing them over. It's like cash, but in much larger denominations. How large? Mae asked, trying to sound casual. Oh, quite large indeed. Bearer bonds are typically issued in denominations of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands. They were very popular before the war, World War II, especially in Europe. Mrs. Henderson turned several pages, showing Mae examples of various bond certificates. Many wealthy families used them to preserve their wealth during uncertain times. Mae stared at the examples, her mind racing. The documents she'd found looked remarkably similar to the illustrations in the book. The same formal layout, the same elaborate seals, the same careful typography that spoke of official importance. Are they still valuable? Mae asked. If they're legitimate and haven't matured? Absolutely. Some of these old European bonds, if they survived the war, could be worth enormous sums today. The accumulated interest alone over 20 years would be... Mrs. Henderson paused to calculate. Well, let's just say it would be life-changing money. Mae's legs felt weak. Life-changing money, hidden beneath the floor of her $2 boat. Of course, Mrs. Henderson continued, unaware of the bomb she'd just detonated in Mae's young mind. There were problems during and after the war. Some bonds were stolen by fleeing officials, others were seized by occupying forces. The rightful ownership of many wartime bonds has been disputed for decades. The word stolen hit Mae like a physical blow. She managed to maintain her composure long enough to thank Mrs. Henderson and check out a basic book about investments. But her mind was spinning as she walked home. That evening, Mae returned to the Wandering Rose with new understanding and growing dread. Using the flashlight she'd borrowed from Aunt Ruby's kitchen drawer, she carefully examined the hidden documents again. Now that she knew what to look for, the evidence was unmistakable. These were indeed bearer bonds, issued by various European governments and corporations in the 1930s and early 1940s. The denominations, when she could decipher them, were staggering. 10,000 Deutsche Marks, 50,000 Swiss francs, 25,000 British pounds. Some bore the seals of banks that Mae recognized from her library research, prestigious institutions that had weathered the war and emerged stronger. But it was the dates that troubled her most. Many of the bonds were issued between 1938 and 1943, the height of World War II, when Europe was torn apart by conflict and millions of people fled their homes with whatever valuables they could carry. Mae sat on the cabin bunk with Biscuit pressed against her side, the full weight of her discovery settling over her like a heavy blanket. If Mrs. Henderson was right about the values, and if these bonds were legitimate, she was looking at more money than existed in all of Millbrook combined. But if Mrs. Henderson was also right about the problems with wartime bonds, if these were stolen or disputed, then Mae wasn't just the finder of a treasure. She was the unwitting keeper of someone else's stolen wealth. Sleep became impossible. Mae would lie in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while questions tormented her. Who had hidden these bonds? How had they ended up in a fishing boat in a small American coastal town? Were they stolen from families fleeing the Nazis? Were they the hidden wealth of war criminals? Or were they the legitimate savings of refugees who had entrusted their future to the Wandering Rose's secret compartment? During the day, Mae found herself studying the faces of her neighbors with new eyes. Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store, counting and recounting the small bills in her register. Mr. Johnson, whose arthritis was getting worse, but who couldn't afford to see a doctor regularly. The families along Harbour Street whose houses needed repairs they couldn't afford, whose children wore clothes patched and repatched until they could be worn no more. The bearer bonds hidden in her boat could change all of their lives. The money could save the failing businesses, fund medical care for those who needed it, send the brightest children to college, regardless of their family's means. Mae had the power to transform Millbrook from a struggling community into a thriving one, but only if the money was rightfully hers to use. Only if claiming it wouldn't make her complicit in some decades-old crime. She didn't understand. The moral weight was crushing for a 10-year-old mind. Mae had been raised by a mother who valued honesty above all else, who had taught her that taking something that didn't belong to you was wrong, regardless of how much good you intended to do with it. But Mae had also been raised to help others, to use whatever gifts she possessed in service of her community. What did you do when those two principles collided? Biscuit seemed to sense her turmoil. The faithful dog rarely left her side during those difficult days, offering silent comfort with his presence. When Mae would sit by the harbor, wrestling with impossible decisions, Biscuit would lean against her leg, his warm weight a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in the world. One evening, as Mae sat on the Wandering Rose's deck watching sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink, she made a resolution. She would not make any decisions based on ignorance or assumption. Before she determined what to do with the bonds, she would learn everything she could about their origins. If they were stolen, she would find a way to return them to their rightful owners or their heirs. If they were abandoned by people who had died without heirs, she would use them to honor their memory through service to others. If they were legitimately ownerless, she would accept the responsibility that came with such wealth and use it wisely. But first, she had to know the truth. And finding the truth about wartime bonds hidden in a fishing boat would require more research than the Millbrook Public Library could provide. Mae was about to embark on an investigation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, about the difference between wealth and worth, and about the true meaning of treasure. The bearer bonds had given her the power to change lives. Now she had to decide whether she had the wisdom to use that power well. Mae's investigation began in earnest the following week. She had convinced Mrs. Henderson that her school project required deeper research, and the kindly librarian had helped her request materials from the regional library system. Books about World War II, financial records from the 1940s, and newspaper archives arrived in neat stacks that Mae consumed with the intensity of someone much older. The thick history book that became her primary guide was titled Europe's Lost Treasures, The Wartime Displacement of Wealth and Assets. Its pages were dense with information that made Mae's stomach turn, but she forced herself to read every word, taking careful notes in a composition book she'd purchased with coins saved from her odd jobs. The more she learned, the darker the picture became. During World War II, Nazi forces had systematically looted artwork, jewelry, cash, and bearer bonds from occupied territories. Jewish families fleeing persecution had often converted their assets to bearer bonds, believing the portable securities would be easier to hide and transport than bulky valuables. Those same bonds had frequently been seized at border crossings, stolen from hiding places, or taken from victims who would never survive to reclaim them. But the theft hadn't ended with the war. In the chaos of post-war Europe, bearer bonds had changed hands countless times. Some were sold on black markets, others were smuggled to neutral countries, and many simply vanished into private collections where their origins were deliberately obscured. Mae read testimonies from survivors who had spent decades searching for family assets that had disappeared during the war. She learned about Swiss banks that had held stolen bonds for years, claiming ignorance about their origins while profiting from their value. She discovered that even in 1963, 20 years after the war's end, thousands of families were still fighting legal battles to reclaim stolen wealth. The history book included photographs that haunted Mae's dreams, families at train stations, clutching suitcases that contained their life savings in negotiable securities, unaware they were heading toward destruction. Children Mae's own age, holding parents' hands as they walked toward uncertain futures, never knowing that their family's financial security was hidden in documents that would soon be stolen or lost forever. One evening, As Mae sat in the Wandering Rose's cabin with her research spread around her, she forced herself to confront the most likely truth about her discovery. The bonds hidden beneath the floor had probably belonged to people who died in concentration camps, people who had trusted these securities to preserve their families' futures, but who never lived to reclaim them. The money she'd found wasn't just stolen, it was blood money, purchased with lives and dreams and families torn apart by hatred. Mae closed the history book and leaned back against the cabin wall, feeling sick. Biscuit whined softly and pressed closer to her side, sensing her distress. How could she even think about using money that had been taken from murdered families? How could she benefit from assets that represented such profound injustice? But as the weeks passed and Mae continued her research, she also became increasingly aware of the suffering around her in present-day Millbrook. Her heightened sensitivity to injustice, awakened by learning about the Holocaust, made her notice inequalities she'd previously accepted as normal. Mrs. Patterson's grocery store was indeed failing, not because she was a poor businesswoman, but because half her customers couldn't afford to pay their bills on time. Mae watched the elderly woman's face grow more haggard each week as she tried to balance compassion for struggling neighbors against her own need to survive. The Johnson family's situation was even more desperate. Mr. Johnson's arthritis had worsened to the point where he could barely work, but the family couldn't afford medical treatment. Mae overheard conversations between Mrs. Johnson and other women at church, quiet discussions about whether they could afford to fill prescriptions or whether they should stretch the medication they had. At the harbor, Mae watched aging fishermen whose boats needed repairs they couldn't afford. She saw children her own age wearing clothes that had been mended so many times. The original fabric was barely visible. She noticed that the school's books were old and worn, that the playground equipment was rusted and dangerous, that the community had needs that far exceeded its resources, and Mae began to understand something else, something that her research into wartime Europe had made clear, but that she'd never fully grasped about her own community. Poverty wasn't just about having less money. It was about having less power, less opportunity, less hope for change. As the only black child in most of her classes, Mae had always been aware of being different. But now she began to understand that difference in economic terms. The families who struggled most were often those who'd been systematically excluded from the town's better opportunities. The fishing industry that was Millbrook's economic backbone had informal networks that favored certain families, certain backgrounds, certain skin colors. Mae realized that even if she could somehow use the bearer bonds to help her community, the people who needed help most might be the last to receive it. The complex moral equation was becoming even more complicated. Her research into legal precedents for handling recovered wartime assets offered little comfort. She learned about restitution programs that had helped some families recover stolen property, but these programs required extensive documentation that the original owners were rarely able to provide. She read about cases where recovered assets had been tied up in legal proceedings for decades while lawyers grew rich and survivors grew old. The most troubling discovery was how often recovered wealth had ended up benefiting institutions rather than individuals. Swiss banks had faced international pressure to return wartime deposits, but much of the money had gone to create memorial funds and educational programs rather than reaching the families of original owners. Mae began to understand that even if she tried to return the bonds to their rightful owners, the practical challenges might be insurmountable. How could she prove who had owned bearer bonds that carried no names? How could she trace families that had been scattered or destroyed by genocide? How could she navigate international legal systems that seemed designed to frustrate rather than facilitate justice? But the most devastating realization came when Mae read about time limitations on wartime claims. In many jurisdictions, the legal right to reclaim stolen assets expired after a certain number of years. The bonds hidden in her boat might already be legally ownerless, regardless of their moral provenance. The research was transforming Mae in ways she hadn't expected. She was learning to think like an adult about complex moral problems that had no clear answers. She was developing an understanding of historical injustice that went far beyond anything taught in her school's sanitized history lessons. She was gaining insight into the connections between past and present suffering that most adults never fully grasped. Most importantly, she was beginning to understand that moral choices weren't always between good and evil. Sometimes they were between competing goods, between honoring the dead and helping the living, between justice and mercy. The bearer bonds remained hidden beneath the Wandering Rose's floor. But they were no longer just a financial discovery. They had become a test of character that would determine not just what Mae did with unexpected wealth, but who she would become as a person. Every evening, as she returned the history book to its hiding place beneath her bed, Mae felt the weight of decisions yet to be made. She was no longer just a 10-year-old girl with a secret. She was becoming the guardian of a moral challenge that would shape the rest of her life. The morning Mae found Mr. Peterson sitting on his front porch with his head in his hands. She knew something terrible had happened. The crumpled legal document on the ground beside him told the story before she read a single word. Foreclosure notice, 30 days to vacate. A century-old family farm about to be lost to unpaid debts. Mae had always admired the Peterson farm. It stretched along the inland side of Millbrook, its weathered red barn and neat rows of vegetables representing a kind of stability that her own life had never known. The Petersons had 3 children, including Sarah, who was in Mae's grade at school. Sarah had never been unkind to Mae, but she'd never been particularly friendly either. The invisible gulf between established families and newcomers was just another fact of life Mae had learned to accept. Now, watching Mr. Peterson's shoulders shake with silent sobs, Mae felt that gulf disappear entirely. Suffering recognized suffering, regardless of skin color or social standing. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," Mae said quietly as she passed with Biscuit. He looked up, his eyes red and defeated. "Morning, Mae. Guess you heard the news." Mae hadn't heard anything, but the paper on the ground made explanation unnecessary. "I'm sorry, sir. 20 years I've been struggling to keep this place going. Thought I could make it work, thought things would turn around." He picked up the foreclosure notice and stared at it as if hoping the words might change. "Don't know what I'm going to tell the children." Mae wanted to say something comforting, but what could a 10-year-old offer a grown man facing the loss of his life's work? Instead, she simply stood there, bearing witness to his pain, understanding in a way she'd never understood before, that adults weren't immune to the kind of helplessness she'd felt when her mother died. As the days passed, Mae began noticing signs of struggle everywhere. Mrs. Chen's nephew had taken over the corner market after her death, but he was clearly overwhelmed by the responsibilities. Shelves that had once been fully stocked now had gaps where inventory couldn't be replaced. The credit ledger behind the counter grew thicker each week as neighbors asked to pay next time for necessities they couldn't afford. At the post office, Mae overheard conversations that revealed the scope of Millbrook's financial distress. The Morrison family was behind on their mortgage. The textile factory that employed a dozen women had reduced everyone's hours. The elementary school was considering combining grades because they couldn't afford to keep all their teachers. Even Aunt Ruby, Mae realized with growing awareness, was struggling more than she'd admitted. The woman who'd taken Mae in more from duty than affection was working longer hours at the hotel, cleaning more rooms for the same pay. Mae noticed that dinner portions had gotten smaller, that Aunt Ruby had stopped buying the small luxuries that had occasionally brightened their modest home. But it was Dr. Morrison's situation that affected Mae most deeply. The elderly physician had served Millbrook for 30 years, delivering babies and treating everything from broken bones to pneumonia. Mae learned from overheard church conversations that Dr. Morrison had been providing free medical care to families who couldn't pay, absorbing the costs himself rather than turning away sick children or desperate parents. The result was predictable. Dr. Morrison's own finances were collapsing. He'd mortgaged his house to keep his practice running, sold his car to pay for medical supplies, and was now facing the possibility of closing the only medical facility in a 20-mile radius. Mae watched 13-year-old Tommy Rodriguez leave school permanently to work at the harbor. His dreams of becoming a teacher sacrificed to his family's immediate need for income. She saw Maria Santos wearing the same dress to church every Sunday because it was the only decent one she owned. She observed how quickly conversation stopped when she approached, adults protecting children from knowledge of how precarious their world had become. The weight of her secret knowledge became unbearable. Every day, Mae saw people suffering from problems that the bearer bonds could solve immediately. While she wrestled with the moral implications of using potentially stolen money, real people were losing their homes, their health, their futures. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in late August. Mae had spent the afternoon at the harbor, watching Mr. Peterson load his family's possessions into a borrowed truck. The farm had been sold to pay debts, and the Petersons were moving to Portland, where Mr. Peterson hoped to find factory work. As Mae walked home, she passed Dr. Morrison's office and saw him sitting alone at his desk, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. Through the window, she could see the defeat in his posture, the exhaustion of a man who'd given everything he had to serve others and was now facing financial ruin as his reward. That night, Mae made a decision that would change her life forever. She would use the bearer bonds to help her community. Not all of them. She wasn't ready to abandon her moral reservations entirely, but she would find a way to convert some of the bonds into cash and distribute that money where it was needed most. She would do it anonymously, carefully, in ways that couldn't be traced back to her or to the bonds' questionable origins. Mae told herself that the original owners of the bonds were beyond help. They were dead, their families scattered or destroyed, their claims impossible to verify after 20 years. But the people of Millbrook were suffering now, in ways she could see and address. If the bonds truly were stolen from Holocaust victims, perhaps the best way to honor those victims was to use their wealth to prevent present-day suffering. Perhaps the money could do more good saving Dr. Morrison's practice than it could sitting hidden beneath a boat's floorboards. Mae began developing a systematic approach to her plan. She would research each family's situation carefully, determining who needed help most urgently and what form that help should take. She would find ways to provide assistance that wouldn't raise suspicions about the source of the money. She would create plausible explanations for the community's good fortune: distant relatives, anonymous benefactors, unexpected inheritances. The planning required Mae to think like an adult about complex logistical challenges. How could she convert bearer bonds to cash without arousing suspicion? How could she deliver money anonymously? How could she ensure that her assistance actually reached the people who needed it most? But beneath the practical considerations lay a deeper transformation. Mae was accepting responsibility for other people's welfare in ways that no 10-year-old should have to contemplate. She was becoming a guardian of her community's well-being, making decisions that would affect dozens of lives. The weight of that responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Mae understood that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Once she began using the bonds, she would be committed to a lifetime of secrecy, a lifetime of carefully managed generosity, a lifetime of being the invisible force that shaped her community's destiny. As she sat in the Wandering Roses cabin that evening, surrounded by her research and her plans, Mae felt the last vestiges of childhood slip away. She was still 10 years old, but she was no longer thinking like a child. She was thinking like someone who held other people's lives in her hands. The bearer bonds represented more than money now. They represented power, responsibility, and the burden of making moral choices in an imperfect world. Mae was about to discover whether she had the wisdom to use that power well. Mae's world shattered on a Tuesday morning in early September when she found the photograph tucked between pages of a library book about Holocaust survivors. She'd been researching documentation methods, trying to understand how families had preserved records of their stolen assets. When the small black and white photograph slipped from the book's pages and fluttered to the library table, the image showed a group of people at what appeared to be a memorial ceremony, survivors and family members standing before a wall inscribed with names. But it wasn't the ceremony that made Mae's heart stop. It was the object one elderly man held in his weathered hands, a bearer bond certificate identical to the ones hidden beneath her boat's floor. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Samuel Rosen displays a Swiss government bond stolen from his family during deportation from Vienna. 1943, Mr. Rosen recently recovered the bond through international restitution efforts and donated its value to Holocaust memorial organizations." Mae stared at the photograph until her vision blurred. The bond in Samuel Rosen's hands bore the same ornate border, the same formal seals, the same careful typography as the documents she'd been planning to use for her community's benefit. But now those familiar features carried a different meaning entirely. These weren't just wartime assets of questionable origin. They were specific, identifiable documents stolen from specific families during the most systematic persecution in human history. Mae's hands trembled as she turned to the book's index, searching for more references to recovered bearer bonds. What she found made her stomach clench with horror and shame. The Rosen family had been wealthy merchants in Vienna before the war. When the Nazis began seizing Jewish assets, Samuel's father had converted the family's savings to bearer bonds, believing the portable securities would be easier to hide or transport if they needed to flee. The bonds had been sewn into the lining of coats, hidden in children's toys, concealed in ways that desperate parents hoped might preserve their family's future. But the Nazis had been thorough in their theft. At deportation centers, families were stripped of everything valuable. Wedding rings were pulled from fingers, gold teeth were extracted, and bearer bonds were confiscated along with other portable wealth. The stolen securities were then distributed among Nazi officials, collaborators, and sympathizers who saw opportunity in genocide. Mae read account after account of similar stories. The Goldstein family of Prague had hidden bearer bonds worth 200,000 Czech crowns in their daughter's doll, bonds that were discovered and seized when the family was arrested. The Levy family of Amsterdam had converted their jewelry business into bearer bonds, only to have them stolen during a house search that preceded their deportation to Auschwitz. None of these families had survived the war. Their bearer bonds had enriched the very people who murdered them. Mae felt physically sick as the implications became clear. The documents hidden in her boat weren't just stolen. They were blood money, purchased with the lives of entire families. Every certificate represented dreams destroyed, futures stolen. Children who would never grow up to reclaim their inheritance. She stumbled from the library in a daze, barely managing to return the books to Mrs. Henderson before rushing to the harbor where Biscuit waited. The familiar comfort of the Wandering Rose's cabin felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath its floor. Mae retrieved one of the bearer bonds from its hiding place and examined it with new eyes. The Austrian seal, the German text, the dates that coincided with the height of Nazi persecution. Every detail now told a story of suffering that made her previous moral struggles seem simple by comparison. This wasn't a question of whether to use potentially stolen money for good purposes. This was about whether she could live with benefiting from genocide, whether she could sleep at night knowing that her community's prosperity was built on the systematic murder of innocent families. The answer was immediate and absolute. She could not. Mae spent the next several days in a state of emotional devastation that worried even Aunt Ruby. She picked at her food, barely slept, and spent long hours sitting alone with Biscuit, wrestling with the magnitude of what she'd discovered. But as the initial shock gave way to deeper reflection, Mae began to understand something important about her situation. She wasn't responsible for the theft of these bonds. That crime had been committed by people who were now dead or beyond justice. But she was responsible for what happened to them now that they were in her possession. Mae returned to her research with new purpose, this time focusing on Holocaust restitution efforts and memorialization projects. She learned about organizations dedicated to returning stolen assets to survivor families, about memorial foundations that honored victims through educational and charitable work, but the complex international efforts to address the financial legacy of Nazi persecution. Most importantly, she discovered that many survivor families had made explicit choices about recovered assets. Rather than keeping money that carried such painful associations, many had donated recovered wealth to charitable causes, particularly those that helped vulnerable communities or fought against persecution. Samuel Rosen, the man in the photograph, had donated his recovered bonds' value to a foundation that provided educational opportunities for refugee children. Other families had funded medical research, supported civil rights organizations, or established scholarships for students studying Holocaust. History Mae began to see a path forward, one that honored the victims while addressing present-day suffering in ways those victims might have supported. She couldn't return the bonds to their original owners who were dead. She couldn't trace the specific families involved, since bearer bonds carried no names and the documentation of their theft had been deliberately destroyed or scattered. But she could ensure that the wealth stolen from those families was used in ways that reflected their values and honored their memory. Mae's research revealed that many Holocaust victims had been people who valued education, community service, and helping those in need. Jewish traditions emphasized charity and social responsibility. The families whose bonds she'd found would likely have supported efforts to help struggling communities, provide medical care for the poor, and create opportunities for children, regardless of their background. Using the bonds to help Millbrook's struggling families wouldn't erase the injustice of their theft, but it would transform blood money into a force for healing. It would ensure that wealth stolen through hatred would be returned to the world through love. Mae made a decision that would guide the rest of her life. She would use the bearer bonds to help her community, but she would do so as an agent of the original owners, not as their beneficiary. Every donation would be made in memory of Holocaust victims. Every act of assistance would honor the families whose wealth had been stolen. She would become the guardian of their legacy, ensuring that money taken through cruelty would be returned through kindness. The transformation in Mae's thinking was profound. She was no longer a child who'd stumbled upon treasure. She was the keeper of a sacred trust, responsible for ensuring that historical injustice was transformed into present-day healing. Mae carefully returned the bearer bond to its hiding place, but her relationship with the hidden wealth had changed forever. These documents were no longer her discovery. They were her responsibility, a burden she would carry with honor and humility. As she sat in the Wandering Roses cabin that evening, watching sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and purple, Mae felt the weight of history settling on her 10-year-old shoulders. She was about to become part of a story that stretched back to the darkest chapters of human history and forward into a future she was only beginning to imagine. The bearer bonds would change Millbrook, but they would change Mae even more. She was no longer just helping her community. She was participating in humanity's ongoing effort to answer evil with good, to transform suffering into healing, to ensure that the victims of history's greatest crimes were remembered through acts of love rather than forgotten in silence. Mae had found her life's purpose in the most unexpected place. As the guardian of stolen wealth that she would spend the rest of her life returning to the world through service to others. Mae's transformation from child to secret guardian began with a composition notebook she'd bought for 25 cents from the school supplies section at Patterson's grocery store. The notebook became her most treasured possession, more valuable than the bearer bonds themselves because it contained something even more precious. Her plans to honor the dead while healing the living. On the notebook's first page, Mae wrote in her careful 10-year-old script, "In memory of those whose wealth this was." Below that, she began documenting everything she'd learned about Holocaust victims and restitution efforts. But the notebook's true purpose lay in its subsequent pages, where Mae methodically catalogued every struggling family in Millbrook, their specific needs, and her plans to address those needs in ways that would honor the victims whose money would fund the assistance. The Peterson family was first on her list, though they'd already lost their farm. Mae had learned they were struggling to afford rent in Portland while Mr. Peterson searched for steady work. She calculated that an anonymous inheritance from a distant relative of $3,000 would allow them to secure decent housing and give Mr. Peterson time to find employment that matched his skills. Dr. Morrison occupied 3 full pages in Mae's notebook. His medical practice was drowning in debt from providing free care to families who couldn't pay. Mae researched the specific costs of maintaining a rural medical practice: equipment, supplies, building maintenance, staff wages. She determined that $20,000, distributed over several years through various means, would stabilize the practice permanently while allowing Dr. Morrison to continue serving those who couldn't afford medical care. The elementary school required a different approach. Mae couldn't simply deliver cash to the principal without raising questions about the source. Instead, she planned a series of anonymous donations targeting specific needs. New textbooks donated by a publishing company, playground equipment, funded by a children's safety foundation, and teacher supplies provided by an educational charity. Mae's research into converting bearer bonds to usable funds led her to the Millbrook Savings and Trust, where Mr. Edwin Walsh served as the bank's only manager. Walsh was a man in his 60s who'd seen enough of life to understand that not all questions needed to be asked. He'd worked in international banking before returning to his hometown, and Mae sensed he might be sympathetic to her unusual situation. Her approach to Mr. Walsh required careful preparation. Mae spent weeks developing her story, practicing it until she could deliver it with the conviction that only comes from believing in your cause. She would present herself as the representative of a private charitable foundation established by families who'd lost relatives in the war. The foundation, she would explain, specialized in quiet assistance to struggling communities, preferring to work through local intermediaries rather than formal institutions. The story was close enough to the truth to feel authentic, but vague enough to discourage detailed questions. Mae's first meeting with Mr. Walsh took place on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September. She dressed in her best church clothes and practiced walking with the confidence she'd observed in adults who commanded respect. Biscuit waited outside the bank, his presence providing Mae with emotional support even from a distance. "Mr. Walsh," Mae began, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "I represent a charitable foundation that helps communities affected by wartime losses. We've identified Millbrook as a place where quiet assistance could make a significant difference." Walsh studied her with curiosity rather than skepticism. "That's quite an undertaking for someone your age. May I ask how you became involved with this foundation?" Mae had prepared for this question. "My family had connections to people who were helped by similar organizations after the war. They taught me that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to help the living." The truth in those words must have resonated with Walsh, because his expression softened. "I served in Europe during the war," he said quietly. "I saw what some families lost, and I saw what some communities lost as well. If there are people willing to help places like Millbrook recover, I'd be honored to assist." Over the following weeks, Mae and Mr. Walsh developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and unspoken understanding. Walsh asked few questions about the source of Mae's funds, and Mae provided exactly the level of detail necessary to satisfy banking regulations without revealing more than required. The process of converting bearer bonds to cash proved more complex than Mae had anticipated, but Walsh's experience with international securities made the transactions possible. He explained that some of the bonds had appreciated significantly in value over the 20 years since their issue, meaning Mae's discovery was worth even more than she'd initially calculated. Each evening, Mae would return to the Wandering Rose with Biscuit and update her notebook with new plans and calculations. The boat's cabin had become her secret office, the hidden compartment beneath the floor her private treasury. But the space felt different now, less like a child's hideaway and more like a command center for operations that would affect dozens of lives. Mae's planning became increasingly sophisticated as she learned more about the mechanics of charitable giving. She researched tax laws related to anonymous donations, studied the protocols of established charitable foundations, and developed systems for distributing assistance that would avoid creating suspicion or dependency. The most challenging aspect of her planning wasn't logistical, it was emotional. Every night, Mae wrestled with the magnitude of what she was undertaking. At 10 years old, she was making decisions that would determine whether families kept their homes, whether sick people received medical care, whether children had opportunities for education and advancement. The responsibility was overwhelming, but Mae found strength in her growing understanding of the victims whose wealth she was stewarding. Through her research, she'd learned about Jewish traditions of charity that emphasized helping others as a religious and moral obligation. She'd read about families who donated their entire life savings to help refugees and persecution victims, even when they themselves faced uncertain futures. The Holocaust victims, whose bonds she'd found hadn't just been wealthy people who'd happened to suffer tragedy. They'd been people who valued community service, education, and helping those in need. Using their wealth to assist struggling families wasn't just Mae's interpretation of what they would have wanted. It was consistent with values they'd demonstrated throughout their lives. Mae's notebook grew thicker as she refined her plans. She developed timelines for assistance that would spread the help over several years, avoiding the suspicion that might arise from sudden, simultaneous windfalls throughout the community. She created elaborate cover stories for each donation, researching actual charitable organizations whose names she could invoke to explain the source of unexpected assistance. But beneath all the planning and preparation, Mae grappled with moments of profound doubt. Late at night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to Aunt Ruby's breathing from the next room, Mae wondered whether she was making the right choice. The bearer bonds could secure her own future in ways she'd never dared imagine. She could use them to attend college, to escape the limitations of growing up poor and motherless in a struggling town. She could ensure that she never faced the kind of financial desperation she saw around her every day. Instead, she was choosing to give that security away, to trust that honoring the victims of historical injustice was more important than protecting her own future. At 10 years old, Mae was making a sacrifice that most adults would find impossible to contemplate. But each time doubt crept in, Mae would think about Samuel Rosen holding his recovered bearer bond, about the families who donated their restitution money to help other victims of persecution, about the tradition of using recovered Holocaust assets to fight against present-day suffering. She would think about Dr. Morrison sitting alone in his office, facing financial ruin as his reward for serving others. She would remember Mr. Peterson's broken posture as he read his foreclosure notice, and the shame in Mrs. Patterson's eyes as she counted and recounted the few dollars in her till. Missy was 10 years old, but she understood something that many adults never learn, that wealth's true value isn't measured by what it can buy for yourself, but by how much suffering it can alleviate for others. As October approached and Mae finalized her plans for beginning the assistance program, she felt the weight of her decisions settling into her bones. She was about to cross a line that would define the rest of her life. Once she began distributing the wealth, there would be no going back, no claiming ignorance, no abandoning the responsibility she'd accepted. Mae Wallace was about to become the secret guardian of Millbrook, the invisible force that would transform her community through anonymous generosity funded by money, stolen from Holocaust victims who'd never lived, to see justice for their suffering. The notebook that contained her plans had become sacred text, a covenant between Mae and the dead, a promise to ensure that wealth stolen through hatred would be returned to the world through love. In 3 days, she would make her first donation. The rest of her life would follow from that choice. The plain white envelope looked innocent enough as Mae sealed it with hands that trembled despite her resolve. Inside were $50 $20 bills, more money than Mrs. Patterson's grocery store usually saw in a month, along with a handwritten note that Mae had crafted, with the same care a diplomat might use for a peace treaty. "Dear Mrs. Patterson," the note read in Mae's careful script, "a group of local families who have been blessed with good fortune wish to help ensure that Millbrook's essential businesses remain strong. Please accept this contribution toward restocking your store and continuing to serve our community. Your kindness to struggling families has not gone unnoticed. Sincerely, friends of Millbrook." Mae had practiced writing the note a dozen times, experimenting with different wordings until she found phrasing that felt both generous and believable. She'd even changed her handwriting style, practicing a slightly more adult script that wouldn't be recognizable as belonging to a 10-year-old girl. The plan for delivering the envelope had been rehearsed with equal care. Mae knew that Mrs. Patterson always arrived at the store before dawn to receive the daily bread delivery. She would leave the envelope tucked under the store's front door, where Mrs. Patterson would discover it as she opened for business. Mae would be positioned across the street behind the post office, where she could observe Mrs. Patterson's reaction while remaining hidden. At 5:30 on a Thursday morning, Mae slipped from Aunt Ruby's house with Biscuit padding silently beside her. The town was still dark, with only the harbor lights and a few fishing boats visible in the distance. Mae's heart pounded as she approached Patterson's grocery store, but her hands were steady as she tucked the envelope exactly where she'd planned. 20 minutes later, Mae crouched behind the post office's corner, Biscuit pressed against her leg, both of them watching as Mrs. Patterson's familiar figure approached her store. The older woman looked tired even from a distance, her shoulders carrying the weight of months of financial struggle. Mae held her breath as Mrs. Patterson bent to unlock her door. The envelope fluttered to the ground as the door opened, and Mae watched Mrs. Patterson's face transform from confusion to disbelief, to wonder as she read the note and saw the contents. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily on her store's front step, clutching the envelope and the note, her body shaking with what Mae realized were tears of relief. The sight hit Mae with unexpected force. This was the power she wielded, the ability to transform despair into hope with the simple act of sharing wealth that had been stolen from families who would never benefit from it themselves. But watching Mrs. Patterson's reaction also brought home the enormous responsibility Mae had accepted. This wasn't a game or a childish fantasy. These were real people with real needs, and Mae's decisions would determine whether they struggled or thrived, whether they kept their dignity or lost everything. Over the following weeks, Mae implemented her plan with methodical precision. Her second donation targeted the Johnson family's mounting medical bills. Working through Mr. Walsh at the bank, Mae arranged for an anonymous charitable fund to pay Dr. Morrison directly for the Johnsons' outstanding costs, with a note explaining that a regional foundation for rural medical assistance had selected their case for support. The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. Johnson cried when Dr. Morrison called to tell her the bills had been paid in full. Mr. Johnson's arthritis medication, which the family had been rationing to make it last longer, could now be taken as prescribed. For the first time in months, the Johnson children could participate in school activities without their parents, worrying about medical expenses. Mae's third donation addressed the elementary school's desperate need for updated textbooks and supplies. She arranged for packages to arrive with documentation suggesting they'd been donated by a Educational Materials Foundation based in Boston. The books were current editions, the supplies were high quality, and the total value exceeded $3,000. The community's reaction to these mysterious benefactions became the subject of constant speculation. At church, Mae listened to conversations about the guardian angel who seemed determined to help Millbrook's struggling families. Some people theorized about wealthy former residents who'd made good and were now giving back to their hometown. Others suggested the donations might be connected to government programs or religious organizations. Mae found it both thrilling and terrifying to hear her work discussed with such wonder and gratitude. She was becoming part of Millbrook folklore, even as she remained, completely invisible as the source of the community's good fortune. This challenge of maintaining her secret while participating in the community's joy required constant vigilance. Mae had to react to news of the donations with the same surprise and curiosity as everyone else. She had to ask innocent questions about the mysterious benefactor without revealing any special knowledge about the donation's true source. But the hardest part was controlling her own emotions when she saw the impact of her assistance. When Mrs. Patterson restocked her store's shelves and resumed extending credit to families who needed groceries, Mae felt pride and satisfaction that threatened to show on her face. When she overheard Dr. Morrison telling another adult that the mysterious foundation had allowed him to continue serving patients regardless of their ability to pay, Mae had to excuse herself before her smile gave her away. The bearer bonds had given Mae power she'd never imagined possible, but they'd also given her a loneliness that was uniquely profound. She was transforming her community's future, but she could never share that accomplishment with anyone. She was honoring Holocaust victims through service to others, but the victims themselves would never know their wealth was being used to heal rather than harm. Mae's notebook filled with records of each donation, not just the amounts and recipients, but her observations about the community's responses and her own growing understanding of how charitable work should be conducted. She was learning lessons about human nature, about the psychology of giving and receiving, about the delicate balance between helping people and preserving their dignity. Most importantly, Mae was discovering that wealth's true power didn't come from what it could buy, but from what it could heal. Each envelope she prepared, each donation she arranged through Mr. Walsh, each problem she solved through anonymous generosity, confirmed her understanding that the bearer bonds' real value lay not in their monetary worth, but in their capacity to transform suffering into hope. As autumn deepened and Mae's assistance program expanded, she began to understand that she'd found her life's calling. She would spend the rest of her years as Millbrook's secret guardian, the invisible force that ensured no family lost their home to unpayable debts. No child went without medical care. No dreams died simply because poverty made them impossible to pursue. The white envelope that had started everything sat in Mae's notebook as a reminder of the moment she'd chosen service over self-interest, community over personal gain, healing over hoarding. It represented not just her first donation, but her first step toward becoming the person she was meant to be. Mae's most ambitious project began with a conversation she overheard at the post office in late November. Mayor Fletcher was discussing the town's budget with the postmaster, lamenting that Millbrook couldn't afford to repair the old community hall that had served for decades as a gathering place for meetings, social events, and children's activities. Buildings beyond saving, Mayor Fletcher said sadly. Roof leaks, foundations cracked, and we'd need $50,000 just to make it safe, let alone functional. Might as well tear it down and leave the lot empty. That evening, Mae sat in the Wandering Roses cabin with her notebook open to a fresh page. $50,000 was more money than she'd distributed in all her previous donations combined, but she had it. More importantly, she had a vision of what a new community center could mean for Millbrook's future. The project required more sophisticated planning than Mae's previous donations. She couldn't simply leave an envelope full of cash for such a large amount. Instead, she worked with Mr. Walsh to establish the Millbrook Community Development Foundation, a legitimate charitable organization, with Mae as its anonymous benefactor and Walsh as its public representative. The foundation's mission statement, which Mae crafted with careful attention to honoring Holocaust victims while serving her community, read, "Dedicated to creating lasting positive change in communities affected by historical losses, ensuring that places of gathering and learning serve as monuments to human resilience and hope." Mae spent weeks coordinating with Mayor Fletcher through Walsh, who presented the foundation's offer to fund a new community center as the result of a national infrastructure improvement initiative focused on rural communities. The mayor was initially skeptical. Millbrook rarely received such generous attention from outside organizations. But Walsh's reputation and the foundation's legitimate documentation convinced him to accept. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp January morning, with most of Millbrook's residents gathered to witness the beginning of their new community center's construction. Mae positioned herself at the edge of the crowd, far enough away to avoid attention, but close enough to see Mayor Fletcher turn the first shovel of earth. As she watched her neighbors celebrate, Mae felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing a project and everything to do with fulfilling a sacred trust. The money stolen from Holocaust victims was being transformed into something that would serve families for generations. A place where children could learn and play safely, where seniors could gather for companionship, where the community could come together in times of celebration and sorrow. Construction proceeded rapidly through the spring, and Mae watched with quiet pride as the building took shape. She'd insisted through Walsh that the structure be built to last, with quality materials and craftsmanship that would serve the community for decades. No detail was overlooked, from soundproof meeting rooms that could accommodate multiple simultaneous activities to a commercial kitchen that could serve large gatherings. But Mae's most important contribution to the center's design was a small granite stone set into the building's foundation, visible to everyone who entered, but modest enough not to draw excessive attention. The stone bore a simple inscription that only Mae fully understood: "In memory of those lost, in service to those who remain." When the community center opened in late June, the transformation in Millbrook was immediate and profound. Children who'd previously had nowhere to play after school now had supervised activities and educational programs. Seniors who'd been isolated in their homes found companionship and purpose through organized social activities. Families struggling with various challenges could access support services and community resources. The center became the heart of a revitalized Millbrook. With a proper venue for community meetings, residents began organizing more effectively to address local challenges. The space hosted small businesses meetings that led to new entrepreneurial ventures. Young people who might have left town after graduation found reasons to stay and contribute to their community's growing vitality. Mae watched these changes unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd not just donated money, but invested in her community's future. Families who'd been planning to leave Millbrook for lack of opportunities began to see possibilities they hadn't imagined. The population stabilized and even began to grow slightly as word spread about the town's remarkable transformation. The ripple effects extended beyond what Mae had anticipated. Local businesses began to thrive as community events brought people together more frequently. The success of Millbrook's mysterious benefactor attracted attention from state officials, who began considering additional investments in rural community development. Other towns looked to Millbrook as a model for how small communities could revitalize themselves. But for Mae, the most meaningful moment came 3 months after the center's opening, when she attended a memorial service for old Mrs. Chen, who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. The service was held in the center's main hall, with the entire community gathered to honor a woman who'd served Millbrook for 40 years through her corner market. As Mae listened to speaker after speaker share memories of Mrs. Chen's kindness and generosity, she realized that the community center had become exactly what she'd hoped, a place where people came together to celebrate what was best in human nature, to support each other through difficult times, and to build the kind of connections that made small communities more than just collections of individual families. The granite stone with its memorial inscription caught the afternoon light, streaming through the center's windows, and Mae felt the presence of the Holocaust victims whose wealth had made this gathering possible. They would never be acknowledged publicly for their contribution to Millbrook's transformation, but their memory was preserved in every act of kindness that took place within the center's walls. Mae had succeeded in transforming blood money into a legacy of healing. The bearer bonds stolen from murdered families had become a community center where children learned to read, where seniors found companionship, where families celebrated life's joys and supported each other through its sorrows. As the memorial service concluded and Mae watched her, neighbors filing out of the building, neighbors whose lives had been quietly improved by her anonymous generosity, she felt a peace that had eluded her since the day she'd first discovered the hidden compartment in her boat. She was 11 years old now, but Mae Wallace had found her life's purpose. She would spend the coming decades as Millbrook's invisible guardian, ensuring that the wealth stolen from Holocaust victims continued to generate healing, hope, and human connection for generations yet to come. The community center stood as her monument not to herself, but to the victims who'd made it possible, and to the community it would serve long after Mae herself was gone. Mae's hands rested quietly in her lap as she finished her story. The documentary cameras still rolling, but their operators sitting in stunned silence. The afternoon light had shifted during the hours of conversation, casting different shadows across her living room. But Mae's composure remained constant, the serenity of someone who'd lived with extraordinary secrets and found peace in their burden. Sarah, the documentary producer, was the first to speak. "Mae," she said softly, "do you realize what you've told us? You've spent 60 years giving away a fortune that could have made you one of the wealthiest people in the state. You chose to live as a school custodian, to rent this modest house, to remain invisible while transforming your entire community." Mae smiled, her fingers finding the familiar weight of her mother's locket. "I chose to honor people who never got the chance to make their own choices about their wealth. I chose to become the person my mother raised me to be, even when that choice was more difficult than I could have imagined at 10 years old." The cameraman lowered his equipment, clearly moved by what he'd heard. "But the sacrifice, giving up financial security, a life of comfort, recognition for your incredible generosity. Don't you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you'd kept even part of those bonds for yourself?" Mae's eyes grew distant for a moment, seeing not the interviewer's face, but decades of memories, children she'd helped through school, families she'd kept in their homes, medical bills she'd paid, dreams she'd made possible. "I know exactly what my life would have been like," she said. "It would have been smaller, lonelier, emptier. Wealth you keep for yourself can buy many things, but it can't buy the satisfaction of watching a community thrive, knowing that your choices helped create that thriving." Through the windows of Mae's modest home, the modern Millbrook spread out in testament to her words. The community center she'd funded bustled with activity, teenagers working on homework in the computer lab, seniors attending a health seminar, children's laughter echoing from the after-school program. The medical clinic that had grown from Dr. Morrison's original practice now served 3 neighboring towns. The harbor that had once seemed destined for economic collapse now supported a mix of traditional fishing and new maritime businesses. "Tell us about Biscuit," Sarah said gently. "He was your only confidant through all of this." Mae's expression softened with a mixture of joy and sadness. "Biscuit lived to be 17, extraordinary for a dog his size. He was with me through every donation, every difficult decision, every moment of doubt, and every moment of satisfaction. When he finally passed, he was lying on that same cabin bunk where we'd made so many plans together. I believe he understood what we were doing, that we were keeping faith with people who deserved better than they'd received from the world. The documentary crew exchanged glances, recognizing they'd stumbled upon a story that transcended their original expectations. They'd come to Millbrook chasing rumors about a mysterious benefactor, expecting perhaps to uncover a story about anonymous charity. Instead, they'd discovered a narrative that spanned decades and touched on themes of justice, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. "What happened to the boat?" the cameraman asked. "The Wandering Rose, where it all began." Mae chuckled. "She's still there, though she's been restored properly now. I've maintained her all these years. She's seaworthy again, though I rarely take her out. She's my sanctuary, the place where I go to think and remember. The hidden compartment is empty now, has been for 40 years, but sometimes I still sit in that cabin and remember the day that changed everything." Sarah leaned forward. "Do you hope that people will learn your real identity from this documentary? After 60 years of anonymity, aren't you ready for recognition?" Mae shook her head decisively. Recognition was never the point. The point was ensuring that money stolen through hatred was returned to the world through love. The point was proving that wealth's true value lies not in what it can buy for yourself, but in how much suffering it can alleviate for others. She paused, looking around her living room, with its simple furniture and walls covered with photographs of graduations, weddings and community celebrations, events where her hidden generosity had played a role, though her presence was never acknowledged. "I hope this story might inspire others to understand that we all have opportunities to choose service over self-interest, community over personal gain. The amounts don't matter. Whether it's $2 or 2 million, wealth becomes meaningful only when it's used to lift others up." As the interview concluded and the crew prepared to leave, Mae walked with them toward the door. Through the window, she could see children playing in the community center's playground, seniors sitting on benches in the small park she'd funded, families walking together along the harbor that had been revitalized through decades of her careful assistance. "There's one more thing," Mae said, stopping at a small frame hanging beside her front door. Inside were 2 crumpled dollar bills, the same bills she'd saved from odd jobs in the summer of 1963, the money that had purchased a broken boat and ultimately changed her life. "I kept these as a reminder that every journey toward purpose begins with a single choice, to see possibility where others see problems." The documentary crew departed, leaving Mae alone with her memories and her profound sense of completion. She'd finally shared the secret that had shaped 6 decades of her life, but the sharing hadn't diminished her sense of purpose. If anything, speaking the story aloud had confirmed her understanding that she'd made the right choice at every crucial moment. That evening, Mae walked to the harbor as she'd done thousands of times before. The Wandering Rose sat at anchor in the marina, her restored hull gleaming in the sunset. The community center's lights were just coming on as the after-school programs gave way to evening activities. Children called to each other across the playground, their voices carrying the promise of futures made possible by choices a 10-year-old girl had made in service to people she'd never meet. Mae stood at the harbor's edge, watching the tide come in, and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with $2 and a broken boat. She'd found treasure beyond imagining, but the real wealth hadn't been in the bearer bonds themselves, it had been in the opportunity. They'd provided to honor the dead while serving the living, the Holocaust victims whose wealth she'd stewarded would never be forgotten. Not because their names were carved in marble monuments, but because their legacy lived on in every act of kindness that took place in the community center they'd unknowingly funded. In every life that had been improved by the anonymous generosity their stolen wealth had made possible. Mae Wallace had spent 60 years proving that true treasure isn't measured by what you can accumulate, but by what you're willing to give away. In choosing to honor the victims of history's greatest crime through service to her community, she'd transformed blood money into a legacy of healing that would endure long after she was gone. As the stars began to appear over Millbrook Harbor, Mae felt the deep satisfaction that comes only to those who've discovered life's greatest secret, that we become wealthy not by taking more for ourselves, but by ensuring that others have enough to flourish. Her story was complete, but her legacy would continue forever in the thriving community that bore silent witness to one child's decision to choose love over fear, service over self, and healing over hatred.